50 miles north of Berlin, hidden beneath towering pine trees and the morning mist of northern Germany, stood a place that would become synonymous with unimaginable horror. Yet unlike Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, or Dachau, this camp's name has been largely forgotten by history. This was Ravensbrück, the largest concentration camp for women in Nazi Germany, where over 130,000 women and children from across Europe would face systematic torture, medical experimentation, and death. What happened here was so horrific that many historians argue it surpassed even the notorious camps we remember today. In November 1938, as Europe teetered on the brink of war, Heinrich Himmler made a calculated decision that would seal the fate of tens of thousands of innocent lives. He needed a new kind of facility, one specifically designed to imprison, torture, and eliminate women who posed any threat to Nazi ideology. The location he chose was as deceptive as it was strategic. Nestled in the scenic countryside near the village of Ravensbrück, surrounded by pristine lakes and dense forests that would muffle the screams of the dying. This remote site offered perfect isolation while maintaining convenient rail connections to Berlin. Construction began immediately. 500 prisoners from Sachsenhausen concentration camp were transferred to this wooded site to build their own prison. Working with their bare hands under armed guard, these men constructed 14 wooden barracks, a kitchen, an infirmary, and a separate compound for male prisoners, completely isolated from what would become the women's section. The irony was bitter. The very people marked for destruction were forced to create the machinery of their own annihilation. By spring 1939, the first female prisoners began arriving from the recently closed Lichtenberg camp. The initial design called for 6,000 inmates, but this number would prove tragically inadequate. Within 6 years, this facility would expand into a sprawling complex of horror housing over 50,000 prisoners at its peak, with more than 130,000 women and children passing through its gates during its operational period. The demographics of Ravensbrück revealed the true scope of Nazi persecution. These weren't just Jewish women, though they comprised roughly 20% of the population. The camp held political prisoners who had dared to resist the regime, Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to renounce their faith, Roma women labeled as social undesirables, prostitutes, lesbians, and anyone the Nazis deemed dangerous to their vision of racial purity. By 1942, the prisoner population included women from over 30 countries. Polish women made up the largest group at 36%, followed by Soviet citizens at 21%, Germans and Austrians at 18%, and thousands more from Hungary, France, Czechoslovakia, and across occupied Europe. What made Ravensbrück unique among Nazi camps was its administration. Unlike other concentration camps run primarily by male SS officers, Ravensbrück operated almost entirely under female supervision. These weren't SS members, but rather civilian employees known as Aufseherinnen, female overseers who would prove every bit as brutal as their male counterparts in other camps. Beginning in 1942, Ravensbrück served as the primary training ground for over 4,000 female guards, who would later staff concentration camps across the Nazi Empire. Among these guards emerged figures whose cruelty would become legendary. Elfriede Müller earned the nickname the Beast of Ravensbrück for her savage treatment of prisoners. Irma Grese, who began her career here in 1942, would later transfer to Auschwitz, where she became known as the Hyena. These women, some barely out of their teens, learned to inflict systematic torture with a methodical precision that horrified even hardened SS officers. The camp's first commandant was SS officer Max Kogel, who assumed control in early 1940. He would be succeeded by Fritz Suren in August 1942, a man whose name would become synonymous with the camp's darkest period. Under Suren's leadership, Ravensbrück transformed from a prison into an industrial killing machine, incorporating forced labor, medical experimentation, and mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Daily life in Ravensbrück was designed to strip away every shred of human dignity. Prisoners rose before dawn to the sound of whistles and barking dogs. Roll call could last for hours as guards methodically counted their human inventory, forcing women to stand motionless in rain, snow, or blazing heat while searching for any excuse to inflict punishment. The wooden barracks, originally designed to house hundreds, were packed with thousands of emaciated bodies sleeping in 3-tiered bunks. Sanitary conditions were deliberately inadequate. with a handful of toilets serving entire buildings, creating breeding grounds for typhus, dysentery, and other diseases that claimed thousands of lives. Food became a weapon of slow murder. Daily rations consisted of watery soup and a thin slice of black bread, calculated to keep prisoners alive just long enough to extract maximum labor before death claimed them. As the camp became increasingly overcrowded after 1943, even these meager rations dwindled. Women fought over scrap, searched through garbage for potato peels, and watched helplessly as their bodies wasted away to skeletal remains. The work assignments were death sentences distributed with bureaucratic efficiency. Initially, prisoners helped expand the camp itself, constructing additional barracks and facilities with their bare hands. By 1942, Ravensbrück had transformed into an industrial complex where inmates manufactured war supplies for the German military. Women worked from dawn until dusk in factories and workshops, sewing uniforms, knitting blankets, assembling electrical components, and producing materials for the Wehrmacht. The Siemens Company operated 20 workshops outside the camp, where shackled prisoners labored on precision equipment under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Those who could no longer work faced immediate selection for death. Guards regularly conducted inspections, separating the weak from those still capable of labor. The condemned were often told they were being transferred to easier work assignments or medical facilities. Instead, they were transported to killing centers or executed within the camp itself. But perhaps the most notorious aspect of Ravensbrück was its role as a center for medical experimentation. In July 1942, Professor Karl Gebhardt, chair of orthopedic surgery at the University of Berlin and Heinrich Himmler's personal physician, arrived at the camp to conduct experiments that would redefine the boundaries of human cruelty. His subjects were 75 young Polish women, members of the underground resistance who had been selected specifically for their youth and physical fitness. These women would become known as the rabbits because they were used like laboratory animals in grotesque medical procedures. Gebhardt's experiments were designed to test treatments for infected war wounds by deliberately creating similar injuries on healthy prisoners. The women had their leg bones broken, muscles cut open, and wounds packed with bacteria, wood chips, glass, and dirt to induce gas gangrene. German doctors then tested various sulfanilamide drugs to see if they could treat the resulting infections. The procedures were conducted without anesthesia in a makeshift operating room within the camp hospital. Women were strapped to tables while SS physicians made deep incisions in their legs, removed sections of bone and muscle, and infected the wounds with deadly bacteria. Many died on the operating table. Others survived only to face repeated surgeries, sometimes as many as 8 operations on the same patient. 16-year-old Barbara Pietrzyk was the youngest of the rabbits. She endured 5 separate operations in 1942 alone, resulting in permanent paralysis of her left leg. Though she survived the initial experiments, the damage to her body proved fatal. She died in 1947 at just 22 years old, her death certificate listing the cause as complications from her experimental surgeries. The solidarity among the rabbits became a source of strength that the SS could never break. These young women, many former scouts and resistance fighters, refused to let their tormentors destroy their humanity. They developed ingenious methods of communication, passing messages between operations and documenting their experiences. Kreisha Chiz wrote detailed accounts using her own urine as ink, smuggling these testimonies out through sympathetic prisoners who worked in other sections of the camp. The rabbits' courage extended beyond mere survival. They organized protests against the illegal experiments, staging work slowdowns and refusing to cooperate with medical staff. Their defiance reached the outside world when messages were smuggled to the Polish underground radio network in London. These broadcasts alerted the international community to the horrors occurring at Ravensbrück and specifically warned Nazi officials that they would be held accountable for their crimes. When the SS planned to execute the remaining rabbits in February 1945, the entire camp population rallied to save them. During morning roll call, prisoners created a human shield, grabbing the marked women and hiding them throughout the barracks. For nearly 3 months, 63 rabbits were concealed within the camp, while SS guards conducted daily searches. Prisoners shared their meager food rations, provided water, and risked their own lives to protect these women. Not a single rabbit was betrayed, demonstrating the extraordinary bonds of solidarity that flourished even in this place of systematic cruelty. The medical experiments extended far beyond the rabbits. SS doctors conducted sterilization procedures on hundreds of Roma women, exposing their reproductive organs to massive doses of X-ray radiation. These procedures caused severe burns, permanent organ damage, and agonizing deaths from radiation poisoning. Children as young as 8 were subjected to these sterilization experiments, their small bodies unable to withstand the massive radiation exposure. Pregnant women faced particular horrors at Ravensbrück. SS Dr. Rosenthal and his assistant Gerda Quernheim performed forced abortions using barbaric methods designed to inflict maximum suffering. When babies were occasionally allowed to be born, they were immediately separated from their mothers and murdered. Witnesses described infants being drowned, thrown into sealed rooms to suffocate, or tossed alive into the crematorium furnace. These killings were often performed in front of the mothers as a form of psychological torture. The camp's hospital became a chamber of horrors where medicine was perverted into systematic torture. Prisoners suffering from minor ailments were injected with experimental drugs that caused excruciating pain and death. Others were deliberately infected with diseases so doctors could study the progression of various illnesses. The Hippocratic Oath's promise to first do no harm was completely abandoned in service of Nazi ideology and pseudo-scientific research. As the war progressed and Germany's military situation deteriorated, conditions at Ravensbrück became increasingly desperate. The camp, originally designed for 6,000 prisoners, swelled to house over 50,000 by early 1945. Overcrowding reached catastrophic levels with women packed into barracks like sardines, often forced to sleep standing up due to lack of space. The sanitation system completely collapsed under this strain, creating breeding grounds for typhus, cholera, and other epidemic diseases. Food shortages became so severe that prisoners resorted to eating grass, tree bark, and anything remotely edible they could find. The camp's garbage pits became sources of sustenance as starving women fought over potato peels and scraps of moldy bread. Guards began using hunger as a deliberate weapon, reducing rations to starvation levels while forcing prisoners to perform increasingly demanding labor. Violence became routine and arbitrary. Female guards competed to demonstrate their cruelty, earning promotions and recognition for their brutality. They hurled scissors at women forced to work in sewing workshops, beat prisoners with clubs for minor infractions, and staged elaborate punishments designed to terrorize the entire population. The psychological warfare was as systematic as the physical torture, with guards deliberately separating mothers from daughters, friends from companions, to break down the support networks that helped prisoners survive. Despite these conditions, acts of resistance continued throughout the camp's operation. French prisoners organized clandestine cells that gathered intelligence and planned sabotage operations. Polish women maintained their national identity through secret cultural activities, teaching younger prisoners about their homeland's history and traditions. Soviet prisoners shared their military knowledge, helping others understand the war's progression and maintain hope for liberation. One of the most remarkable figures was Geneviève de Gaulle Anthonioz, the 19-year-old niece of Charles de Gaulle. Captured while working with the French resistance in 1943, she became a symbol of hope within the camp. She secretly circulated news of Allied advances, whispered encouragement to despairing prisoners, and maintained the spirit of resistance, even in the face of certain death. Her presence reminded fellow prisoners that the outside world continued fighting for their freedom. The women of Ravensbrück also demonstrated extraordinary compassion amid unimaginable cruelty. Older prisoners adopted orphaned children, sharing their food and providing maternal comfort. Women from different countries overcame language barriers to care for one another, creating makeshift families bound by shared suffering. They organized secret schools where educated prisoners taught illiterate women to read, conducted religious services for believers of all faiths, and even staged clandestine cultural performances to maintain their humanity. In late 1944, as Soviet forces approached from the east and Nazi defeat became inevitable, Heinrich Himmler ordered the acceleration of killing operations at Ravensbrück. The SS constructed a provisional gas chamber in a wooden shed adjacent to the crematorium. This crude facility, hastily built as the war entered its final phase, would claim between 5,000 and 6,000 lives in its brief operational period. The gas chamber at Ravensbrück used Zyklon B, the same crystalline hydrogen cyanide employed at Auschwitz and other extermination camps. Unlike the sophisticated killing facilities at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Ravensbrück gas chamber was a primitive structure that reflected the desperation of the Nazi regime's final months. Prisoners selected for gassing were told they were being transferred to shower facilities or medical treatment centers. Instead, they were herded into the sealed chamber where SS personnel released the deadly gas through makeshift vents. The killing process was deliberately inefficient, designed to inflict maximum terror on the camp population. Bodies were cremated in the camp's ovens, with thick black smoke visible for miles around the facility. The SS forced surviving prisoners to work in the crematorium, loading corpses into furnaces and scattering ashes in nearby forests. These prisoner work details, known as Sonderkommandos, faced the psychological trauma of handling the bodies of their fellow inmates while knowing their own deaths were imminent. As Soviet artillery grew audible in the distance during early 1945, SS officials began implementing desperate measures to conceal their crimes. The systematic destruction of documents accelerated as Nazi leadership recognized that their industrial murder operation would soon be exposed to the world. Prisoners were forced to burn records, dismantle equipment, and eliminate any evidence that might incriminate their captors. On March 25, 1945, Heinrich Himmler issued evacuation orders that would claim thousands of additional lives. Fritz Züren received instructions to remove all physically capable prisoners from the camp, leaving behind only those too sick to travel. The plan was cynical in its calculation. Living witnesses could testify to Nazi crimes, but corpses could not speak. The evacuation began with brutal efficiency. Over 24,000 women were forced into columns and marched northwest toward the Baltic coast. Many wore nothing but thin prison uniforms and wooden clogs, completely inadequate for the harsh northern German winter. Guards shot anyone who fell behind, collapsed from exhaustion, or attempted to escape. The roads leading away from Ravensbrück became littered with bodies, marking the final chapter of Nazi cruelty toward their victims. Maria Moldenhauer, a German political prisoner, later described the march as a moving cemetery. Women died every few hundred meters from exhaustion, starvation, and exposure. The guards showed no mercy, executing prisoners who could no longer keep pace with gunshots to the head. Those who survived remembered marching through snow and sleet for days without adequate food, water, or rest. Some prisoners were more fortunate. Through negotiations with the International Red Cross, approximately 7,500 women were evacuated to Sweden, Switzerland, and France during the final week. Count Folke Bernadotte's white buses transported survivors across the Baltic, saving lives that would otherwise have been lost in the death marches or final liquidation of the camp. On April 30, 1945, soldiers of the Soviet Red Army finally reached Ravensbrück. What they discovered defied comprehension, even for troops hardened by years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front. Approximately 2,000 prisoners remained in the camp, most too sick or weak to have joined the evacuation marches. These survivors were barely recognizable as human beings, their bodies reduced to skeletal frames covered in disease-ravaged skin. Captain Vasily Grossman, the renowned Soviet war correspondent, was among the first journalists to document the liberation of Ravensbrück. His dispatches described a scene of systematic horror that challenged the limits of human language. The camp's warehouses contained mountains of human hair, thousands of pairs of shoes, and personal belongings stripped from murdered victims. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Soviet medical personnel worked desperately to save the surviving prisoners, but many died in the days following liberation despite their best efforts. Dr. Nina Markova, a Soviet army physician, later wrote that the survivors suffered from typhus, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and advanced starvation. Their bodies had been so systematically destroyed that even basic medical care came too late for hundreds of women. The precise number of victims murdered at Ravensbrück remains a subject of ongoing historical research, but scholars have established parameters that convey the staggering scale of the killing. Based on Nazi transportation records, survivor testimonies, and post-war investigations, historians estimate that between 92,000 and 130,000 women and children perished at the camp complex during its 6 years of operation. These numbers represent more than statistics. Each death was a mother, daughter, sister, or friend whose life was cut short by systematic hatred. The victims came from every corner of Nazi-occupied Europe, united in death by their shared persecution under a regime that viewed human life as expendable in service of racial ideology. The liberation of Ravensbrück revealed not just the scope of Nazi crimes, but also the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Survivors who had endured years of systematic torture, starvation, and brutality somehow maintained their capacity for hope, compassion, and resistance. Their testimonies would become crucial evidence in the post-war trials that sought to hold Nazi war criminals accountable for their actions. In the decades that followed, many of Ravensbrück's perpetrators faced justice. Fritz Suren was extradited to France, tried for war crimes, and executed by firing squad in 1950. Professor Karl Gebhardt was convicted at Nuremberg and hanged in 1948. Irma Grese, whose cruelty had been honed at Ravensbrück before her transfer to Auschwitz, was tried by British authorities and executed at just 22 years old. Yet for too long, Ravensbrück remained in the shadow of better-known camps like Auschwitz and Dachau. Its location in what became East Germany made access difficult during the Cold War years. The fact that it was primarily a women's camp contributed to its marginalization by historians who focused on male-dominated facilities. The survivors themselves often struggled to find audiences willing to hear their testimonies about specifically female experiences of Nazi persecution. Today, the site of Ravensbrück serves as a memorial and museum dedicated to preserving the memory of those who suffered and died there. Visitors can walk through reconstructed barracks, view artifacts recovered from the camp, and read testimonies from survivors who refused to let their stories be forgotten. The memorial serves as both a monument to the dead and a warning to the living about the consequences of unchecked hatred and systematic dehumanization. The legacy of Ravensbrück challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for both evil and extraordinary courage. In a place designed to strip away every trace of human dignity, women found ways to maintain their humanity through acts of compassion, resistance, and solidarity. Their stories remind us that even in humanity's darkest moments, the light of human decency can never be completely extinguished. The women who survived Ravensbrück carried forward not just the trauma of their experiences, but also the responsibility of bearing witness. They spoke at trials, wrote memoirs, and dedicated their lives to ensuring that the world would never forget what had happened in that remote corner of northern Germany. Their voices echo across the decades, demanding that we remember not just how they died, but how they lived, resisted, and refused to surrender their essential humanity. In remembering Ravensbrück, we honor not only the dead, but also the living proof that human dignity can survive even the most systematic attempts at its destruction.